The first thing Cecily noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary silence of a great house settling into evening, not the hush of footsteps on carpet or the distant percussion of silver laid for supper, but a human silence, the kind that travels through a room the moment something has gone wrong, and everyone present has decided, by collective unspoken agreement, not to be the one to name it. She had seated herself in the chair at the head of the long mahogany table, the chair nearest the window that looked over the frost-pale lawn, the chair with the carved falcon on its back, and she had done so because it was the finest chair at the table, and she was the Duchess of Ashmore, and she had been the Duchess of Ashmore for precisely 11 days. She felt the silence before she understood it. Warmth climbed her throat. Across the length of the table, the Dowager Duchess, Winifred, sat with both hands folded in her lap and her chin at an angle that managed to convey pity, reproof, and a particular variety of patience all at once. Lady Maren Holcott, who had come for the fortnight with her mother, studied her wineglass with the careful attention of a woman who wished to be somewhere else. The footman at the sideboard had gone very still. Only Pelham, the butler, a man of 63 with gray at his temples and eyes the color of old pewter, moved. He moved slowly, deliberately, and with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why it would matter. He set down the water ewer. He crossed the 12 feet of Aubusson carpet between the sideboard and the table's head. He stopped at Cecily's left shoulder. "Your Grace," he said, his voice low enough that only she and the empty air above the table heard it. "If it would please your Grace, the chair to your right is perhaps better situated for the evening light." He did not touch the chair. He did not touch her. He stood with his hands clasped at his back and waited. And in his waiting there was something that was not quite a warning and not quite a plea, but held the texture of both. Cecily looked at him. She looked at the empty chair to her right, the one with no falcon carved into its back, the one that was slightly lower, the one that any careful observer of this household would have understood at a glance was not the chair she had supposed it to be. She looked at Winifred, who had not moved, who had not spoken, who was exercising the particular cruelty of absolute stillness. She stood. She moved to the chair on the right. She sat and she folded her hands in her lap, and she did not permit a single change in her expression. What she did not know yet, on that cold November evening in 1813, was that the chair she had just vacated had last been occupied by a woman named Dorothea, and that the Duke of Ashmore, who had not yet arrived for supper, had not sat in that chair himself in 4 years, and that the old butler had just done something that would cost him the only currency he possessed, if the Dowager chose to call the debt. She had not yet. Cecily Vane had come to Ashmore Park with 2 trunks, a maid named Pole who was terrified of the dark, and the understanding that she was a practical solution to a practical problem. Her father, Sir Edmund Vane of Herefordshire, had died in September owing the Duke of Ashmore £11,000, a debt accumulated across a series of agricultural investments he had pursued, with all the confidence of a man who had never previously been wrong about anything. The Duke had extended the note twice. When Sir Edmund died without a male heir, the estate's modest income reverted to a cousin in Derbyshire, and the £11,000 became Cecily's inheritance in the most perverse possible sense, the thing that followed her into every room and sat behind every conversation. She was 24. She was not pretty in the way the season rewarded, which was to say not fair, not small, not given to the helplessness that certain men found reassuring. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's steady hands and a quality of attention that made people uncertain whether she was judging them, pitying them, or gathering information she intended to use later. She had been educated past what was strictly useful, had read her father's library in the years when there was no money for a governess, and she spoke with a precision that the Dowager had already, in 11 days, identified as the thing she found most alarming. The evening Cecily had arrived at Ashmore Park, the Duke had been in London on parliamentary matters, and he had remained away for 9 of the 11 days. She had met him 3 times, once at the wedding, where he had pressed her hand once and released it as if completing a necessary procedural step, once in his study the following morning, where he had told her to make free use of the house and direct domestic questions to Pelham, and once in the gallery, 4 days after the wedding, when she had been examining a portrait and he had appeared in the doorway behind her. He had said, "My mother, the late Duchess," of the portrait she was not examining, and "My wife, the late Duchess," of the portrait she was. the late Duchess Dorothea, had been fair and small, and possessed of the quality of contained grace that spoke of a woman who had understood every room she entered before she entered it. In the portrait she wore a cream gown and held a small, dark feathered fan that Cecily had not yet seen anywhere in the house. Her expression was neither happy nor unhappy. It was the expression of a woman watching something with complete attention, content to watch indefinitely. The Duke had looked at the portrait for 4 seconds after naming it, and then had walked away down the gallery without a further word. Pelham had appeared behind Cecily 20 minutes later. He cleared his throat once. "The late Duchess favored the blue salon in the mornings," he said, "and the east garden in fine weather. The household is accustomed to those arrangements." He paused. "I mention it only so that your grace need not wonder why certain rooms feel as though they are still in use." It was the most he had said to her in 11 days. She had looked at him with that quality of attention that unsettled people and said, "Thank you, Pelham." And he had given a small precise nod and withdrawn, and she had understood that he had given her a piece of information that cost him something to give. The supper after the chair incident passed in the register, Cecily had grown accustomed to. Winifred speaking in measured sentences about people in London whose names she did not know, Lady Marin attempting to translate these references into something navigable, and Cecily eating her soup and her fish with the composure of a woman who had decided that composure was the only resource she possessed in sufficient quantity to be strategic about. The Duke did not come down. His secretary appeared at Pelham's ear during the remove, and Winifred said, with a warmth that did not reach her eyes, "Gideon sends his apologies. Estate matters." She looked at Cecily as she said it, not unkindly, in the way one might look at someone who has arrived at a party on the wrong evening and has not yet realized the house is in mourning. "He works late," Cecily said. "He is diligent," Winifred replied, and the word carried the particular weight of a woman selecting precisely the right blade. There is something quietly gutting about being new to a household that has been fluent in itself for 20 years before you arrived. Cecily felt it in the way the maids moved around her, not with hostility, but with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned precisely where to step and had not yet incorporated her presence into that knowledge. She was not avoided. She was simply not yet legible to this house. She watched Pelham move through the rooms and understood that he was the household's grammar, the man who held in his head every arrangement that had ever worked and every occasion that had not. The morning after supper, she went looking for him deliberately. She found him in the butler's pantry, checking the silver inventory against a ledger. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway and did not move to rise. The form of dignity that senior household staff maintain in their own territory. "The chair last night," she said. "Whose chair was it?" Pelham set down the ledger. "It was the late Duchess's chair," he said. "She chose it herself, the first winter she came to Ashmore." She said the falcon on the back reminded her of her father's coat of arms. "The Duke has not sat at table since she died. He takes his meals in the study." Cecily absorbed this. She thought of Winifred's folded hands and the calibrated quality of her stillness. "The Dowager knew," she said. "She did not tell me." Pelham's expression did not change, but something in it became very precise. "No," he said, "she did not." Cecily nodded slowly. She said, "Thank you for what you did last night, Pelham. I imagine it was not comfortable." Something shifted in the pewter of his eyes. "No," he said, "it was not." He paused. "Your Grace might find it useful to know that the Duke generally walks the South Garden at 7 in the morning, when he is in residence. He has been in residence since last evening." She understood, then, that she had been given a second piece of information that cost something to give. Gideon Ashmore, 4th Duke of Ashmore, was 41 years old and moved through the world with the economy of a man who had learned very early to permit himself very little. He was tall without drama, with gray eyes darker than Pelham's and hands that were never entirely still, always adjusting a coat button or refolding a letter, as if stillness were an indulgence he could not quite justify. He had been 16 when his father died and 29 when Dorothea died, and he had understood grief as a debt he would never entirely liquidate. He was in the South Garden at 7:07. He stood at the stone balustrade above the frozen fountain looking out at the bare lime trees, and he did not turn when Cecily's feet found the gravel path behind him. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace," she answered. She came to stand at the balustrade 3 feet to his left. She wore her dark wool pelisse and her most sensible boots. The morning was very cold, and her breath made small pale clouds in the air. He looked at her briefly, with dark gray eyes that carried something more searching than warmth. "You rose early," he said. "I have not been sleeping late," she said. "There is a great deal to learn." He was quiet for a moment. Below them, a single blackbird landed on the frozen lip of the fountain basin, inspected it, and flew away. "Pelham tells me," he said, and stopped. "Yes," she said. "You should have been informed of the household arrangements." "I was not." He turned to look at the lime trees again. His hands, gloved, were entirely still on the balustrade. "I had supposed my mother would manage the introduction to the house," he said. "She has managed several introductions," Cecily said, "to the drawing room, to the music room, to various persons whose relation to your family I am still parsing. The arrangements of the dining room were not among them." He was silent for a longer stretch. "The Dowager Duchess," he said at last, his voice level in a way that was not indifference, "protects what she loves. She is not always precise about the method." He turned to look at her again, and this time held the look. "I should have been here." It was not an apology. It was the plain articulation of a man who had assessed a situation and named his own failure in it, with the same directness he would bring to naming anyone else's. She felt it land in her chest in a way she had not expected. "You are here now," she said. He looked away. His hands moved on the balustrade. "Miss Vane," he said again, and then corrected himself. "Cecily." The name was careful in his mouth, deliberate, as if he had chosen it rather than fallen into it. "I am aware that this arrangement is not what either of us would have chosen." "No," she agreed. "I would not have you uncomfortable in your own house." She thought about the falcon chair, and Winifred's folded hands, and Pelham's 12 feet of carpet crossed at precise cost. "I have been in more uncomfortable positions than a mistaken chair," she said. "I do not require comfort. I require information." Something changed in his face. Not warmth, not yet, but the adjustment of a man recalibrating. He looked at her as though she were a specific text he had not encountered before, and was reading with real interest. "What information?" he said. "Which rooms to avoid? Which arrangements I should not disturb? What this house requires of me that it has not yet said?" He was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then he said, "Come inside. Pelham will show you the house properly. I will walk with you." He did not extend his arm. He turned and walked toward the house, and she fell into step beside him, and neither of them spoke again until they reached the south door, where Pelham was already standing, with his hands clasped, and his expression the quiet satisfaction of a man who has planned for several possible outcomes and finds himself in the correct one. It was Winifred's nature to conduct her campaigns with patience, which made her more dangerous than an antagonist who acted from anger. She had been the mistress of Ashmore Park for 31 years, had been, by the accounting of everyone who knew her, a very good duchess. She had loved Dorothea with the species of love that a woman reserves for a daughter-in-law who understands, without being told, that the house has 2 mistresses, and that grace consists in the management of that indelicacy. She had grieved Dorothea without drama, and managed the household in the 4 years since, with the quiet authority of a woman who knew her authority was temporary and did not permit the temporariness to diminish her. What she had not expected was Cecily. She had expected someone softer, someone whose debt-shadowed position would produce the tractable gratitude that would allow Winifred to remain, in all the ways that mattered, the true Duchess of Ashmore. She had not expected dark eyes that watched her with no resentment and no deference, a steady voice that neither rushed nor retreated, and hands that moved through the rooms of this house as though learning them rather than asking permission of them. "She has no breeding," she said to Lady Marin's mother, Caroline, one morning in the blue salon over tea. "Her father was a very minor baronet. She is simply not equipped for what this position requires." Caroline Holcott looked at her over her teacup and said, "She seems rather capable to me." "Capability," said Winifred, "is not the same as suitability." What she did not know was that Cecily was in the library on the other side of the wall, audible through the connecting door that Pole had left 2 inches open. Pole committed the words to memory and delivered them to Cecily afterward, with the directness of a woman who had decided whose side she was on. Cecily heard no breeding, and simply not equipped, with the same steadiness with which she had heard the chair silence the week before, and she felt it in the tight, careful place behind her sternum, where she had learned to store the things she could not permit to show. She sat down in the library's deep window seat with her hands in her lap and looked at the east garden. For a long time, the frozen beds and the dead rose canes and the single stone pedestal in the center that held an empty basin where a sundial had once been. The tour of Ashmore Park had taken most of that morning, Gideon leading and Pelham supplementing with the efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years learning which detail was essential in every room. The gallery, where the portrait of Dorothea hung between a landscape and a portrait of Gideon's father. A solid man with Gideon's jaw, and none of his reserve. The music room, where a pianoforte stood with its lid closed and a sheet of music open on the stand. Dorothea's handwriting in the margin, a correction to a fingering she had apparently intended to revisit. The study, where Gideon worked at the desk his grandfather had used, and where a small mahogany box sat at the corner that he did not explain, and she did not ask, about. It was in the morning room, a south-facing room with cream walls and pale winter light, and a view of the stone pedestal in the east garden, that he paused in the doorway and did not come in. She looked at the room and then at him, and understood that this was a room he found difficult. The late Duchess used this room, she said. Not a question. Every morning, he said. His hands had gone still against the doorframe. Pelham mentioned the blue salon, she said. My mother prefers the blue salon in the morning. A pause. Dorothea preferred this one. She looked at the pale light and the view of the empty pedestal. She said, she must have watched the garden from here. She planted that garden, he said. The rose beds, the pedestal was a gift from me. She wanted a sundial. I ordered one, and it arrived cracked, and I sent it back, and before a new one came she was gone. He said it plainly, the way a man reports a fact that has been inside him for 4 years and has never fully resolved itself into grief or anger, that exists in a third category for which there is no adequate name. The pedestal has had nothing on it since. She stood in the morning room doorway and looked at the empty pedestal. The tour, she realized, was not only an introduction to rooms. It was the first time he had said any of this aloud to anyone who was not Pelham. She did not say she was sorry. She said, there is a stone merchant in the village. Pole mentioned it. He looked at her, one long look, reading. Then, so briefly she might have imagined it, the corner of his mouth moved in the direction of something that was not quite ease and not quite warmth, but held a suggestion of both. Yes, he said, there is. He had loved Dorothea. This was the thing she had learned, not from his words, which were always stripped to the essential, but from the way the house itself held her memory. The music still open, the morning room unused, the chair unclaimed, the pedestal empty. Grief not performed, but structural, built into the arrangements of the household like a load-bearing wall that everyone moved around without naming it. In the days that followed, he came to supper, which he had not done before, and he sat at the foot of the table. The falcon chair at the head remained empty and unremarked upon. Winifred spoke to him of London and the neighbors with the ease of a woman who had been his closest conversation partner for 4 years, and she spoke to Cecily with the elaborate, punctilious courtesy of a woman who had not yet decided whether the new arrangement was permanent. The dismissive label arrived at supper on the 14th day. Lady Marin's mother, Caroline, had joined them, and a neighbor named Mrs. Pendleton Cross, who managed a property 5 miles away with the compact authority of a widow who needed no one's assistance, had also come in. The conversation moved through half a dozen topics, and then Winifred said, while refilling her wine glass and looking at no one in particular, one does not precisely know what to make of a baronet's daughter as mistress of fine Ashmore. The matter of precedence at county events will be somewhat awkward. She did not look at Cecily. She did not need to. She is simply not equipped for what the position requires. Caroline Holcott looked at her wine glass. Mrs. Pendleton Cross ate her fish and did not speak. Gideon, at the foot of the table, looked at his mother with an expression that produced a controlled silence, after which he said, Cecily is managing admirably. She has an excellent grasp of the household. Of course, said Winifred pleasantly. One does not suggest otherwise. The thing forming between Cecily and Gideon was establishing itself in the ways that such things do, which is to say not through declarations, but through the accumulation of small moments whose meaning neither party was prepared to name. He began to appear in the library and to read at the other end of it without occasion or explanation. She did not ask him why. They spent 2 hours one morning in comfortable parallel occupation that felt like the longest conversation she had had since her arrival. He asked her once what she was reading, and she told him, Chesterfield's Letters, and he said without looking up, Chesterfield was a fraud who happened to write clearly, and she said, "That is not a disqualification from being useful," and he was quiet a moment and then said, "No, I suppose it is not." He learned that she played the pianoforte. She had sat at the instrument in the music room one evening alone. Dorothea's sheet music moved aside to the bench before she touched the keys, set with the care one uses with a thing that belongs to someone else. She had played for 40 minutes, working through Haydn and then a Schubert song her mother had loved, and she had not known he was in the doorway until she finished and heard him there. She turned on the bench and found him with one hand on the doorframe and his face held very carefully. "Forgive me," he said. "I heard it from the study." "You need not apologize for listening to the pianoforte," she said. "I was playing it in a house with walls." He came into the room then, which she understood was not nothing. He stood at the end of the instrument and looked at the Schubert on the stand. He said, "My wife played Dorothea. She was better than I suspect you are, if you will forgive me." "Almost certainly," Cecily said. "I had very little instruction and a great deal of time." He looked at her. "Self-taught?" "Partially. My mother taught me what she knew. She died when I was 12 and I continued without her." He was quiet. He looked at the empty stand where Dorothea's Clementi had been and at the Schubert she had placed there. "She would have liked Schubert," he said. "She would have been interested in what the Germans were doing." He said it in the same tone he used for all plain facts. He looked at her then. "Shall I stay if you play again?" She turned back to the keys. "If you like," she said. He pulled the chair from beside the stand and sat. She played for another half hour. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes closed, and she was aware of the quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of something released. The second voicing of the label came through Lady Marin, who said it to a friend at a card party at Holcott Hall, not knowing that Pole was within hearing of the connecting corridor. Pole committed the words to memory and delivered them to Cecily with the directness of a woman who had decided whose side she was on. "She said you had no natural place in the house," Pole reported. "That you were simply not equipped for a great estate, never having been raised in one, and that it was rather sad, the whole arrangement, when there were so many better-suited women." Cecily listened. She nodded once. "Thank you, Pole," she said. Then she went downstairs and asked Pelham whether the east garden might be planted in spring if appropriate bulbs were ordered in December, and Pelham said, with his precise and costly warmth, that the late Duchess had kept an account at a nursery in Oxford, and that the account was still open. She ordered 60 tulip bulbs and 12 narcissus corms and one large piece of Yorkshire slate to serve as a sundial base, because the stone merchant in the village did not carry sundials, but the ironmonger in Oxford did. And she had learned, in a month at Ashmore Park, that the things one needed were available, if one took the trouble to find them. Perhaps you already see where this is going. The knowing matters less than the watching of it arrive. Pelham brought her the letter from the Oxford nursery himself, and when he set it on the morning-room table, he set it with both hands, as he might have set something breakable. He said, "Her Grace, the late Duchess, always chose yellow for the east beds. She said they were the first thing visible from the morning-room window in March. She understood that the morning-room had a new occupant, and that Pelham had decided this was the correct outcome. Gideon found her in the morning-room one morning in early December, the window light cold and bright, the sundial dial plate lying on the table beside the nursery letter, and a sketch of the bed arrangement. He stood at the window looking down at the stone pedestal, and then at the dial plate, which was a deep olive-green bronze with the hours marked in Roman numerals. He said, "Where did you find this?" "The ironmonger in Oxford carries a catalogue," she said. "Pelham wrote the letter on my behalf." He turned to look at her. He looked at the sketch on the table. He said, "You ordered 60 tulip bulbs." "Yellow," she said. He was silent for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back at the pedestal below and said, "I should have done this years ago." "You were not ready," she said. He turned to look at her again, and this time the look was different from any previous look, direct and specific, and carrying nothing of the procedural, only the fact of a man who has been seen accurately by someone he had not expected to be, capable of seeing him. He said, "How did you know what she liked?" "Pelham," she said. He looked at the dial plate on the table and the sketch beside it. He said at last, "Cecily." The name again, deliberate. "I have not been a considerate husband." "You have been an absent one," she said. "It is a different failing, is it?" "An absent man can return," she said. "I find I prefer the category." He had not been in the morning-room before that morning. He came back the following day, and the day after that, and by the end of the week it was understood, by some process neither of them had named, that the morning room held 2 people now. The crisis came through Winifred on a Thursday morning, when Cecily was in the library with Gideon's cousin, Henrietta, who had arrived for a visit and had taken to Cecily with the warmth of a woman, delighted to find someone who spoke directly. Winifred appeared in the library door with Lady Marin at her shoulder, and a solicitor named Brockhall at her right. "You will forgive the interruption," Winifred said, addressing Henrietta rather than Cecily. "I had hoped to speak with Gideon first, but as he is not available, I have asked Mr. Brockhall to join us so that we may clarify several household matters." Brockhall, a compact man with a neat gray waistcoat, opened a leather case. Without meeting Cecily's eyes, he said that the jointure property allocated under the late Duke's settlement to the present dowager carried protections for the term of her natural life, and that any substantial alteration to the household's management structure would require the dowager's formal agreement as a condition of that jointure. Cecily felt the room sharpen around her. She felt Henrietta go very still in the chair beside her. Winifred looked at Cecily for the first time. Her expression was not triumphant. It was sad, in a way that Cecily thought might be genuine, and careful, and entirely certain of its ground. "It is not a personal matter," she said. "The arrangements of this house have served Ashmore for 30 years. I would not see them disturbed by someone who, however well-intentioned, is simply not equipped to manage what this house requires." There it was. The third voicing, in front of witnesses, with a solicitor in the room, and Henrietta's sharp gray eyes moving between them. Cecily's hands were on the arms of the library chair. She did not remove them. She did not allow her face to change. She thought of the morning room window and the empty pedestal and 60 yellow tulip bulbs and a dial plate in olive green bronze, and a man who had come into her room for 7 days running, and had not once looked at her without the quality of attention she had come to understand was the rarest form of regard he possessed. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Brockhall. I wonder if you would be so good as to wait in the hall." Brockhall blinked. He closed his leather case. He looked at Winifred, who gave him a very small nod, and he withdrew. Cecily stood. She looked at Winifred and said very quietly, "I have not disturbed a single arrangement in this house that I have not had cause to alter or been directly invited to take up. I planted no bulbs in any bed that was already planted. I played the pianoforte in a room empty for 4 years, and I placed the music I found there on the bench with care. I put a sundial on a stone pedestal that has held nothing since 1809. I have done all of this because your son asked me to treat this house as my own. I intend to continue doing so." Winifred looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face moved. "You are not Dorothea," she said, and her voice had shed some of its armor. "No," Cecily said, "I am not, and I suspect Ashmore does not need me to be." She walked out of the library. She walked down the passage and went to the south door and opened it, and stood in the December cold with no pelisse and no gloves and breathed the frozen air until her hands steadied. Pelham found her there 4 minutes later with her pelisse over his arm. He helped her into it without a word. He said, when she was buttoned, "The Duke arrived home 20 minutes ago. He is in the study." She looked at him. "Pelham, how long have you been in this household?" 42 years, he said. "And in 42 years has anyone told him about his mother's methods?" "No," he said. "They have not. Will you take me to the study?" He took her to the study. Gideon was at his desk when she entered, the mahogany box visible at the corner, and he looked up at her face and stood immediately, which she had not expected. He said, "What has happened?" She told him without embellishment, without seeking his sympathy, as one person reports a material fact to another. She told him about Brockhall and the jointure, and the phrase that had been used for the 3rd time in front of Henrietta and a solicitor about a woman who was simply not equipped for what this house required. He listened. He stood with both hands flat on the desk and listened to all of it, and his face held very still, and when she finished there was a silence of 4 seconds. Then he said, "Where is my mother now?" "The blue salon, I believe." He walked out of the study without his coat. Cecily did not follow him immediately. She stood in the study and looked at the mahogany box on the corner of the desk for a long moment, and then she walked after him, because she was the Duchess of Ashmore, and this was her house and she had earned the right to be present in it. The blue salon held Winifred, Lady Marin, and Caroline Holcott, who had the expression of a woman who had watched this gathering form and was regretting her involvement. Gideon was already in the room. Mrs. Pendleton Cross had arrived by some coincidence of timing for her usual Thursday call, and Henrietta was 3 steps behind her in the corridor. The room, in other words, was full of witnesses. Gideon said, "Mother." His voice was controlled and flat and carried no heat because it did not need to. "Brockhall will be dismissed." Winifred looked up at him. Her chin was at that angle again, but something in it was less certain. "Gideon," she said, "the jointure settlement clearly states—" "I know what the settlement states," he said. "I also know that Cecily has managed this household with more grace than it has shown her, and that you have not made her welcome in the way I should have ensured before I left her here. I have not been present as this house required. That is my failure, and I own it. It will not continue." He looked at her steadily. "She is the Duchess of Ashmore. She is the mistress of this house." He turned to look at Cecily in the doorway. The room was very quiet. Lady Marin had gone still. Caroline Holcott was watching her teacup. Mrs. Pendleton Cross, at Cecily's shoulder, had the expression of a woman deeply satisfied by a development she has been expecting. Gideon crossed the room with the particular directness of a man who has decided something and is no longer interested in the question of whether to proceed. He stopped in front of her, and he said, in a voice that was not loud but carried the full weight of the room's attention, "She is my wife, and she is not leaving." 9 words. It named nothing poetic. It was specific and irrevocable, and it was delivered in the exact salon where Winifred had first received her as the new Duchess and introduced her to the household with the calibrated warmth of a woman managing a transition she had not chosen. Winifred looked at her son. Then she looked at Cecily. Her face went through several arrangements. The dignity of a woman who has lost a contest she did not expect to lose. The grief of a woman who has confused her loyalty to a memory with a cruelty to a living person. And finally something quieter, the recognition of a woman who has been corrected by the person she loves most and who understands the correction is just. She said, "Cecily." It was the first time she had used her given name without formality. "I have not been kind." "No," Cecily said. "You have not. I should like to be if you will permit it." Cecily looked at her. She thought about 42 years and a butler who crossed 12 feet of Aubusson carpet at precise cost, and a sundial ordered and lost, and a morning-room window and 60 yellow tulip bulbs. She said, "I would not refuse it." The dinner that evening was the quietest and warmest Ashmore Park had produced in the month of Cecily's residence. Mrs. Pendleton Cross stayed, as she did when events proved diverting, and Henrietta remained, and the conversation moved through 6 or 7 topics without landing on any of the previous tensions. Winifred spoke to Cecily twice, once about the nursery in Oxford, and once about the morning room, which she had apparently entered that afternoon and found. She said, "Remarkably pleasant," which was the closest thing to an apology her vocabulary produced. Gideon sat at the foot of the table and spoke to his cousin and his neighbor and his mother, and once, in the middle of the conversation, he looked across the table at Cecily, directly and without the procedural distance of the previous weeks, and she looked back, and the look held 3 or 4 seconds longer than was strictly necessary. The sundial was installed on the pedestal in the east garden. On a morning in late December, when the ground was frozen and the sky was the pale white, gray of winter in the English Midlands, and the garden was bare of everything except the stone, the iron, and the shadow of the gnomon falling across Roman numerals on olive-green bronze. Pelham supervised the installation himself, which was not strictly part of his duties, and which he performed because 42 years of service had earned him the right to decide which duties were his on occasions that mattered. Gideon came out from the south door when the ironmonger's man had finished and departed with his tools. He stood at the balustrade with Cecily, and they looked at the sundial in the east garden for a long time. The shadow of the gnomon fell across the 10. The December light was flat and precise and caught the edge of the bronze. He said, without looking at her, she would have liked it. "Yes," Cecily said. He was quiet for a moment. His hands on the balustrade were still. "And the tulips," he said, "in March." "Yellow," she said. He turned to look at her, and there was nothing procedural in the look, and nothing managed, and nothing held at a distance. And he said her name, Cecily, for the 3rd time, and this time it was not careful. It was simply the word for the person standing beside him, spoken the way one speaks the name of a thing one has been looking for and has found. His hand moved on the balustrade and covered hers, both of them in gloves, the wool of his against the wool of hers, and he did not remove it, and she did not ask him to. Below them, the gnome's shadow moved so slowly it was imperceptible, and the bronze held the cold light, and the east garden lay bare and ready for spring. In the morning room, the yellow tulip bulbs were already in the ground, planted before the frost set, and they would bloom in March in 60 points of color visible from the window. When they did, Pelham brought a vase of them to the table without being asked, because he had known, from the evening he crossed 12 feet of Aubusson carpet with a water ewer, which way this house was meant to turn. The falcon chair at the head of the mahogany table remained empty, and no one sat in it, and the carved bird on its back looked out over the room in the way that things kept out of love, and things kept out of grief, look exactly the same, until someone arrives who can tell the difference. Pelham pressed one yellow tulip between 2 sheets of paper at the end of March, and left it on the morning room table, and Cecily found it there one morning and set it beside the dial plate sketch she had never put away. That was all. That was enough.